Hi, welcome to Roadmap. I'm Ralph Preston. I'm here again with William Lowe, and tonight we're going to talk about how to apply some of the basic principles of neuroscience to your recovery. If you watch any of these, you know William and I talk back and forth, and tonight William's going to start it off with some observations that he made during his own recovery while he was in school and in working with other stroke survivors. So, William?
Thanks, Ralph. Okay, so I just want to start off by just sharing my own experience of going through recovery after stroke. So I've been through a lot of therapy since I first started my stroke recovery journey. And for those of you who don't know me, that was about 10 years ago, coming up to 11 years this October. And during this time in my recovery after stroke, I've been through a lot of different stages of I guess I've been through a lot of lifetimes, condensed within a 10-year period. So I was actually going to OT school to study to become an occupational therapist for a while. But while I was studying at OT school, I was also helping other stroke survivors on the side in their recovery after stroke. And eventually I decided to stop going to OT school because a lot of the things which they were teaching in OT school, it didn't quite resonate with my own personal and lived experience of going through stroke recovery myself. And also because I wanted to give treatment or provide help to stroke survivors, which was based on what they wanted most and not just treating them as a textbook case. So what I wanted to do today is basically I wanted to share some of the things which you can keep in mind or think about when it comes to your recovery after stroke, especially when you're getting into a phase in your recovery where maybe you're noticing that you're not seeing as many changes as you used to, or maybe you feel like that recovery has come to a standstill, or you've hit a brick wall and you're feeling that you're spinning your wheels. So when I was in OT school, I studied a lot of neuroscience. I read a lot of research articles, and I applied a lot of the research to my own recovery, as well as towards other stroke survivors, and asking them how they found their recovery after they had applied these simple neuroscience basics. And I guess the first principle I want to start with and share is this idea of surrounding your brain in a stimulating environment in your recovery after stroke. So what this basically means is that in order for recovery to actually take place after stroke, your brain is very much a product of its own environment. And what this means is that if you're a fan of recovery, then it would make sense to maximize the opportunities which you present to your brain to use your affected side as much as possible. And so if you're able to maximize the opportunities of therapy around you, then obviously what we can expect is for you to obviously improve a lot quicker and make a lot more progress and see more changes in your recovery after stroke. So when I say stimulating environments and making sure that you're exposing your brain to as many opportunities to exercise and use the affected side as possible, what this would look like is obviously using your affected hand to do everyday tasks such as opening the fridge, opening and turning doorknobs, or even using your affected hand to obviously pick up groceries or pick up the grocery bags as well. And obviously when it comes to stairs, how this would apply to the lower limb or your legs is leading with your affected leg when you're going upstairs, rather than relying mainly on the stronger leg or the non-affected leg to go upstairs, as you were taught when you probably went through therapy through insurance. So what I'm sharing with all of these examples is basically ways you can really get the ball rolling in your recovery and really remind your brain that your affected side is still existent and that it's not completely gone after your stroke. Because in recovery after stroke, based on the conversations I've had with other stroke survivors, is that there is a very high tendency to want to rely mainly on the stronger side to do everything, because you can get by with one side only, and you can do a lot of things with one hand, and you can even walk leading with the stronger leg as well. But in the long run, how this relates to recovery is that it's not very beneficial, because because by relying mainly on the stronger side or non-affected side to do everything, yeah, sure, you might be living your life after stroke, but you certainly won't be recovering and getting back and improving and seeing changes in the affected side, which was affected by your stroke in the first place. That's just one of the principles which I want to share, and I think we'll start off with that. And I just want to pass it over to Ralph now to see if he had any thoughts to share around this idea of stimulating environments and making sure that you maximize opportunities to exercise and expose your brain to how it feels like to use the affected side in everyday tasks.
Well, I sure do. Since you gave a little background, I guess I'll give a little bit of background. I'm coming up on 14 years. That would be next Monday, a week from tomorrow. And I did not go to school. I thought about going to PT school, but I thought, I don't have any college. It'll take me forever. And here I am 14 years later. I could have done it, but I'm a observer, a photographer, a detail-oriented person. I didn't study neuroscience until, last year and a half I have. And what I found is that I kind of discovered a lot of the basic principles through paying attention to my body in my recovery. I would observe something, and if it was positive, then I would head that way. And I had this basic idea that I should try and achieve symmetry, use my affected side as much as possible. Therapy's all around you. That's a newer term, but I read something I wrote 13 years ago today, and on involvement and integration, using your hand for almost everything, and 13 years later it held up. Also, that was my strategy for stopping my own personal therapy. So, because I did 8-10 hours a day for about 15 months, and then I declared I was tired of pulling on rubber bands. But what I did do was from then on, I still intentional walked, and I got involved in day-to-day stuff where I, used both hands. In fact, I used my affected hand to open jars to stay, open the refrigerator. I loaded up with tools and turned the doorknob just like I would with my other hand. Basically, you have a model over on your teaching side. Will teach your healing side exactly what to do. If you don't know what to do, it's right over here on the other side. And like I said, I was a big believer in symmetry and an observation. So I'd look and see what I could do here, and I would then know what I could do here. It's easier to hold my hands up. That was also true with legs, knees, hips, ankles, various body parts. So yeah, you gotta, it's all about the repetitions. So, which I guess we're going to talk about here in a minute. So one of the things about using your affected side and parts in daily life is that you get a lot more repetitions in. Nobody's going to get better by, hanging that arm and dragging that foot. You got to work on the patterns of walking repetitively, and do your repetitions. So that's my observations on the the rich environment. You got dishes, cooking, cutting things, personal habits, brushing your teeth, putting your hair back. There's thousands of things that you can do every day. So just get that affected side involved. So, William?
Yeah. So everything which Ralph has shared, that's basically applying this idea of surrounding your brain in a very stimulating environment conducive to exercise means. And And just out of curiosity, Ralph, I just have a question for you. When you were able to do everyday things with your affected side, say your affected hand, after your recovery after stroke, how how did that feel?
Well, it felt pretty good. I remember the first time I put my hair back, at first, you can't, I couldn't get my hand out of my lap, let alone, behind my head. So I remember it took about 4 months. And even still, I mean, I could do this, but I couldn't get that. I couldn't raise. I was still below. I found that, well, your scapula starts moving when you get above level. So I kind of like cheated below level, and it took a lot to have the dexterity to flip it around because it goes around 3 times. And you have to pass it from one hand to the other. And like, this is totally personal, but to me it felt good. It was motivating. When I did that, I said, well, I mean, that was one of the last things. I remember getting my hand out of my lap. I remember the first time I tied my shoes. It wasn't pretty, but I got them on. And each and every one of those things for me was personally motivating because I felt like, well, I did that, so whatever's next on the list, however long it takes, I'll work on it, and eventually I'll get there. So
Yeah, and I mean, I'm so glad you said that. And obviously, every time you felt more motivated to do it, I'm assuming you saw more changes and progress as you continue to persist with attempting to do that task. Um, and and obviously that allowed you to see more changes in your recovery. Is that right?
yeah, very much. Like I said, I couldn't raise my hand out of my lap for a while. I also had very little movement. It was basically, see, I got some movement going, a flicker of movement, if you will, and I built on it. And it was kind of slow to build on, but once I got out, towards getting closer to full extension, it started coming in quicker, in my experience. But remember, I was doing, pretty intense thing. One thing I didn't mention is when you go at it, I'm not expecting anybody to do what I did, but the more you can go at it in big blocks of time, your brain, we were talking about getting those sides involved in repetitions. One of the things that's important to your brain is it tends to learn in big blocks rather than smaller blocks. It's called mass practice. It's one of the concepts of neuroscience and neuroplasticity. Your brain tends to learn better if you do 2 hours at one time rather than a half an hour 4 times a day. And it's actually been scientifically proven. When we had a meeting on this, somebody thought, well, I have to do 2 or 4 hours of the same thing. No, of course you can do several things, but the more you block stuff together, that's not always easy if you're fighting neurofatigue and other things, standing up, getting your hand to move. But the more you can do that, that's one of the ways that your brain learns. So that's neuroscience.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Ralph, because it also reminded me of the second principle of neuroscience, which some stroke survivors can think about when it comes to guiding their rehab. Sorry, no, not guiding the rehab, but guiding their recovery. And it's this idea of neurons which fire together, wire together. And it's basically this idea that if you continue to repeat something which you're motivated to do, then your brain is more likely to learn it a lot quicker, and it's also able to progress a lot more in your recovery after stroke. So what this means is that in recovery after stroke, some of the signals which your brain used to send to obviously use your arm or lift up your leg, they're not as strong as they used to be. And the way I like to think about it is it's sort of like a power. It's sort of like the PVC covering which you see on your power cords. The more the thickness of the thickness or the strength of the connections which your brain is able to make in your recovery after stroke, it's in direct relation to how often you use your effective side. And in recovery after stroke, your brain actually, when it comes to learning new skills, your brain actually can learn a lot quicker through this concept, which is called associative learning, which is basically this idea that whenever your brain is anticipating a sort of reward when it accomplishes a task, through whether this be through some sort of feedback that it's doing it correctly, then your brain is able to actually connect the dots a lot quicker. So what Ralph said about how it became more motivating to keep persisting in the task every time he got very close to it. This is basically another example of, neurons which fire together, wire together, which basically explains how whenever Ralph's brain got very close to anticipating a reward, for example, accomplishing something which he couldn't do after his stroke, then his brain actually was able to progress more towards actually being able to do that task. And over time, with more repetition, those connections from the brain to his arm, they actually got a lot stronger until he was able to do it. So that's basically this idea of neurons which fire together, wire together. It's this idea that the more you practice something, and the more you're able to practice movements in your recovery after stroke and get back some sort of feedback that you're getting a lot closer to your goal and that you're seeing more progress, then you're actually able to tell your brain and also teach your brain how to actually see more changes and connect the dots a lot quicker in your recovery after stroke.
I got two things I can say real quick. I found that, first of all, I started like just trying to get my affected hand up anywhere near the back of my head. I knew that until I did that, there was, I also worked on, fine motor skills. Well, first gross and then fine. But I always did the pieces, like, can I get both of my hands on my shoe? That kind of thing. And I found as I got closer to like being able to flip it or tie my shoes, I find myself sitting down and untying and tying my shoes, or I'd find myself pulling my hair elastic out and do it just because as I got closer, I guess I wanted it. And I felt like, maybe by repeating it. Same thing with like, say, setting down a glass or picking it up, letting go of glass or picking it up. If I didn't like how I did it, I would just pick it up and put it down, pick it up and put it down until I was happy with it. I had this crazy idea, maybe it's not so crazy, that I should pattern my brain until I got a good one. And I know we're going to talk about good ones and bad habits in a minute, but that's something I don't quite know. If I didn't like something, I don't like it, so I would do it again and again and again. So
yeah, that's right. And I just wanted to add on to that because I think it relates a lot to this idea of neurons which fire together, wire together. So basically what you were saying there is when you were picking up the glass and you only counted the ones which were good, or you only stopped once you did a good one, you were really associating or exposing your brain to the correct experience of actually doing it correctly. And basically this ties into neurons which fire together, wire together, because rather than half-assing an exercise and doing it as you will, you try to pick up the cup in a way which was correct, where you actually got the steps, all of the steps and sequences, whether this be opening up your hand, turning over your wrist beforehand, correct, before you were able to pick up the glass correctly. And I think that's really important because when it comes to recovery after stroke, quality really matters a lot more over quantity. And the quality of the experience which you're exposing your brain to of learning something is more powerful than doing hundreds of repetitions of something, of a movement or of an exercise, which might not represent how your brain used to do something before stroke. And I think that one of the things which is important to remember in recovery after stroke is that our brains, they primarily learn from experience. So what this means is that if you want to really drive recovery, you have to give your brain an experience which is as close as possible to how your brain used to do something before you had your stroke, so that your brain can actually connect the dots between what it used to do before stroke versus how it's going to do it now. When you first do a task in your recovery after stroke, it's going to be very messy at first, but over time, you might find that your brain's going to refine how it does the movement. It's going to slowly connect those dots until it gets it correct. And once it gets that signal correct, that's where, when you really want to capitalize on that, and you just want to expose your brain to doing it correctly until it gets to the point where you've done this exercise or movement so many times correctly that it almost becomes unnatural to do it the wrong way when you first started.
Right.
And what I want to do is I just want to pass it on to Ralph to see if he has any thoughts on that before I share the other final principle of neuroscience, which I think is pretty important when it comes to recovery after stroke.
Not really. The only thing I'd say is I didn't know anything about neuroscience at the time, but somehow or another I felt like if I kept repeating something until I got it right, that I might leave that impression in my brain. I mean, it's just, I was strictly applying observational logic, but it turns out to be neuroscience basically. So, proceed so we can get through all this.
Yeah. Okay. So just one final point with what Ralph said, with making sure that you expose your brain to doing something correctly. This goes hand in hand with that idea of associative learning. So you want to associate your brain with doing something correctly, because, for example, if you're learning how to lift up your leg and walk, this is how you're going to be walking for the rest of your life in your recovery after stroke. So ideally, it would make sense to get it right the first time, rather than trying to just get by and just throw your leg forward. Because unless you're a fan of walking like you're drunk for the rest of your life, then the more practical approach would be to expose your brain to the correct way of doing something, which you're going to be doing a million times for the rest of your life, or every day for the rest of your life. And that actually brings me to the final principle, or I guess thing to keep in mind when it comes to your recovery after stroke. And it's this idea that sometimes when you're in a place where maybe you're noticing that you're not seeing any changes in your recovery, or you're feeling like you've hit a brick wall, a plateau, or you're feeling like you're spinning your wheels, sometimes this occurs because your brain has been conditioned to doing something so much so that it's actually sabotaging itself in being able to see more recovery. And I actually discovered this through a lot of trial and error in my own recovery, as well as helping other stroke survivors and coaching them in theirs. And it's this idea which I came up with. And it's basically this idea that sometimes, in order to make recovery happen in your recovery after stroke, you have to unlearn to learn. And basically what this means is that sometimes, in order to see more progress in your recovery, you have to teach your brain to stop doing the things which it has been conditioned to do, in order to learn the correct things which it has to, in order to actually progress in recovery. So, for example, if you're in a situation where, going back to what I said about walking, that you're noticing that whenever you're walking, it feels like you're walking drunk, in order for you to get to a place where you can actually work, where you can walk with more of a rhythm, such that you're not feeling like you're walking like you're drunk, you're probably going to have to teach your brain how to condition itself how to walking, so that it feels like it's not walking drunk, so that you're exposing it to so many experiences of it walking correctly and not walking drunk, so that you're actually able to see more progress in your recovery. And what this would mean is, this would obviously mean teaching the brain to stop sending the incorrect signals to muscles in your leg, which are causing you to walk like you're feeling you're walking drunk, but rather teaching the brain to teach correct signals to the correct muscles, which your brain actually used before your stroke to actually walk every single day?
Well, if I'm a stroke survivor listening to this, I'm thinking, okay, well, but I can hardly walk, so how am I supposed to walk perfectly? And you can't, I mean, I went through this too, once I got some leg motion and balance, I wasn't afraid of falling. I started working on walking a little further, actually, uh, because I felt like walking a lot would help. However, you have to be careful not to pattern your brain in the wrong way. I kind of did by going after distance. I wouldn't use the word start over. I backed up a good bit and started again because I certainly had retained some of the mobility that it took me the first few months to get. I've also noticed this in the people that I work with. I mean, you can't you don't go from a sit to stand to, walking pretty good in, a couple of walks. So we end up kind of accepting interim ways of doing things where you don't pick your leg up quite as much as you should. You don't do your heel toe pronation and roll off of your heel as well as you should. So unfortunately, it's my opinion that you need to work on several things all at the same time because, for example, if you worked only on one thing and ignored something else, you could develop a bad habit by not paying attention to that over a number of months while you're focused on other things. Of course, the people listening to this are also, realizing, well, you can only, and this was true for me, you can only work on and think about so many things because when I was trying to learn how to walk again after stroke, my brain was like most of the time in overload. I was trying to think about all kinds of things, and then next thing you know, you've forgotten about your arm or something. You kind of got to circle around. In my experience, of course, you can't do this, like I said, right out of the gate. You can't just walk perfectly. But if you can keep the progress moving along, then you don't get stuck with bad habits. I've seen, I had a bad one with hip dip and going long distance, and I fixed it by doing exaggerated heel toe pronation, a bit of a power walk, not quite a John Wayne or monster walk, but a slightly wider stance, and then working it back towards a more normal walk. I worked with a guy who had a regular walker, and he tended to lean over the darn thing. And when we went to transition him away from the walker to a quad cane, it took the better part of a year. We were doing counter work, standing leg extensions, marching, stuff like that at the counter. I was also walking him twice a week for about half an hour. It's about all he could take. And it was the better part of a year before we got him walking with the quad cane, not leaning over like he was the walker. So I guess the long and short of this is be careful about developing bad habits and letting them stay too long, because I found they're harder to get rid of than to, if you can, try and do it more correctly the first time. And of course, it's not going to look good. It's not going to be perfect, but the more you think about form and try and work towards the form you want, then I feel like you're working on all the different parts, and you're much more likely not to get one part stuck or any part stuck for that matter.
Yeah, that's right. 100% agree with what Ralph said, and I think it's the constant process of just calibrating and just calibrating and making sure that your brain is on target, because your brain has its own agenda when it comes to recovery after stroke, and that's basically just relying and compensating with the strong side to do everything. So how you would calibrate and make sure that you're able to guide your brain towards recovery is, for example, if you feel like you're walking drunk, walking like you're drunk, maybe this might be because that you're leaning more toward your strong side whenever you're walking, which is something which a lot of which a lot of my clients have told me. And maybe this is something which you need to address before you're able to actually progress in your recovery, because those bad habits are holding you back. If you're in another situation where maybe your hand or your fingers are completely flexed in, maybe this means that your brain hasn't learned how to relax the muscles which you use to flex the fingers. And this might mean that you need to go seek out some medical intervention, such as Botox injections, to teach your brain how to actually relax the fingers. Or maybe you actually need to use electrical stimulation or something else, or just stop flexing the fingers completely and stay away from that stress or grips for the time being. So I think when it comes to recovery after stroke, there are a lot of things to consider so that you can actually keep recovery going and keep seeing changes. And sometimes taking a counterintuitive approach, such as teaching your brain the correct habits and conditioning your brain to not do certain things, that can actually be beneficial to your recovery after stroke.
Well, I found anytime something wasn't going the way it should, if it didn't open or I couldn't do it, I worked on that. And in your example, a lot of people I work with, one of the first things they do is lean away from that affected side, and they start circumducting, that's swinging your leg in a circle. Both of those are so that your toe doesn't get stuck. A lot of people, I watch videos of people walking, and they're not really even aware they do it. Mirror is a good way to put a mirror at the end of the hallway or something, but paying attention, because if you pay attention to the fact that you're leaning and swinging your leg, then you can say, well, I'm doing these two things, what's the solution? Okay, well, I can tell you the solution is upper leg strength, so you can bend that knee and get that leg up, and then you can work towards, good straight up and down posture and symmetry. And you can start paying attention to putting that affected foot straight forward rather than swinging it. But it only comes when you have the awareness, and then you seek out the solution, and then you pay attention when you're walking to implement that solution as best you can. And if you keep that implementation model moving the whole time, then you're much less likely to end up with bad habits. My experience personally with other people and opinion.
Yeah, that's right. So I hope you guys found this helpful. These are just some basic neuroscience principles to keep in mind. Pun not intended, when you're going about your recovery after stroke. And I found these to be really beneficial if you ever find yourself going through a situation where you've hit a plateau or you're not seeing as many improvements as before. It means that one of these principles is actually being applied to in your recovery. Maybe your brain is developing too many bad habits and it needs to correct these before progressing. Or maybe you're not giving your brain the right amount of feedback or experience through exercise so that it's able to connect the dots a lot better, between what it used to do before stroke and what it's able to do now in your recovery after stroke.
All right, well, that's a good stopping place. We're going to keep doing these, so join us again in the future. The only thing that we didn't really talk about, and I'll just hit on it real quick, is it's really important to believe that if you engage in a well thought out program and pay attention to your body, that you're going to get better. So that would be it. Attitude and belief in yourself and belief in what you're doing are powerful tools. So join us again next week, and we'll explore another subject. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you then.